Good evening. This is Goldy, also known as Mr. Anecdotal, Mr. Pasty, and the Talking Head. It's Wednesday, December 17th, 2014. I am in a secure location. Remember, most importantly, I rant so you don't have to. If you want an inaccurate transcript of this show, send me an email at goldyrant@gmail.com. Anyway, it's been a while. September, I think, was my last rant. Happy to be back. I want to talk a couple of items for you here. The purpose of these rants is for me to get things out of my brain. I'll always try and identify a problem, the many facets of the problem, and pose a solution or solutions, sometimes real, sometimes not, which will then provoke more thinking, and then a potential real solution can arise. We've got protests all over the country. We've got AM radio talking about how the violence and destruction following these non-indictment of police officers proves blacks are more prone to violence. We've got blacks saying that all whites are racists. We've got racists agreeing. I need to go through some stuff, and even though I have spoken about this before, I need to do it again. And by the way, when I use that word racist, I'm about to define it. We are all racists. We're all sexists. Whenever we differentiate, we are an IST. My definition is a simple one. If you recognize a person as somehow different, you have become a racist. If you recognize someone as what sex they are, you are a sexist. I had a friend ask me what I thought about Ferguson. I hesitated. Then I asked if he had a few more minutes. He said yes. Of course. Then I answered. And that was a month ago. Since that time, there have been some other chokehold type deaths at the hands of police, adding to the furor over Ferguson. And there's a bunch of protests right now. A lot of people are out there. As an aside, it's not really an aside actually. When I start talking about this stuff and you respond, I know exactly which channels you watch. I know where you get your news. Your opinion is very, very obvious. I ran across a gentleman who said that he had lived in the projects and that these animals did things like this all the time, and a police killing is justified. And he was talking about the protests that ended in a bunch of violence in Ferguson. These animals did these things all the time. That obviously upset me dramatically. I had a friend a few days ago post a link to a photo of a person flying out of a window of the Twin Towers on 9/11, justifying torture. I've ranted in the past about religious tolerance and the danger of profiling any one group, as when that group is in power, you too are at risk. Christians, you kill me with your war on Christmas. Scared people of any color or religion, you kill me with your lack of history and fear and hatred of Muslims. Your ridiculous fear, instilled upon you by what you watch and where you get your news. So these are types of racism. Let's see where we are. We're all racists and we're all sexists. The question becomes, when do we as a society want to intervene? When, if I work in a restaurant and someone of a certain race comes in and I do not want to serve that person, is that okay? We have to decide that. So since I've defined racism as recognizing people of color and only recognizing people of color, that's my definition of racism. We have to have a term for the advanced form of racism that keeps a server from serving someone in a restaurant. Let's call it uncivilized racism. Now, a few weeks ago or months ago, I talked about what it was to be civilized. One of the things is you let somebody come into your lane when they put their blinker on. Just go ahead. Go ahead. You certainly have a right to speak your mind. I'm speaking mine. You have a right to differentiate between people. You always get in trouble if you happen to say it out in public. So let's talk about South Park for a moment. The F word episode of South Park, where they redefined the word fag and faggot as someone who is a Harley riding douche. And then the gays were fighting the Harleys for the right to use the word. A ridiculous extreme. Genius. On South Park, they have Cartman always hating the Jew. They had an episode called The Passion, where they had a Hitler made out of Cartman, wanting to exterminate the Jews. They have a black kid named Token. You have a right, and South Park shows that. You have a right to be a racist. If you start doing it publicly, or if you say it out loud, or if it affects whether or not you're going to serve somebody at your table, it becomes uncivilized racism. How do we determine that that's happening? That's difficult. I will certainly admit that. I don't know whether the Ferguson and New York killings were due to uncivilized racism, but there are some numbers for other things out there. Whether or not you're looking for institutional racism, which is a belief that over the past 200 to 300 years, our institutions have become so ingrained with racism that you cannot escape it. It's a part of the system. So when I took the capital punishment clinic, I learned from a case in the early 70s that if you're a black who kills a white, you're 10 times more likely to get the death penalty than a white who kills a black. In 2003 to 2005, a devoted group of ACLU activists complaining about racial profiling by the Department of Public Safety in Texas helped pass a law, and this is in a completely Republican legislature with George Bush as the governor. They helped pass a law that required officers in the state Department of Public Safety identify the race of the person they pulled over. A specifically racist act. And when I'm using this word racist, and I just redefined it 15 minutes ago when I was writing this, because that word gets thrown around by everyone without defining what it means. So think about that. They did a racist act, which is you look at the person, you see if they're white, black, or Hispanic, Asian, whatever, and you have to write it down because you pulled that person over. It's a racist act. However, prior to that, Hispanics were included with whites. Since that time, DPS has been more careful with profiling. Because there's information out there. There are numbers out there. It turns out that they had been profiling due to the numbers. So again, going back to Ferguson and determining racism versus uncivilized racism. How many white people die in chokeholds per year by cops? I don't know. Being a cop's not an easy job. They save their own lives. They will save their own lives based on their own self-interest. When in doubt. That's human. We expect it. I just read an article on Westlake Hills. They have cameras on the cops. I've ranted before about cameras. I hate them. There's no control over the images. But this may be a painful compromise. It's certainly an invasion of privacy, but cameras on cops, it's got to help. It's got to help. It seems that incidents are cut down. I mean, I'm saying the exact same argument that they were using when they wanted to put cameras at 12th and Chicon. But in this situation, criminal justice system, the people with the guns, potential solution. Put the cameras on the cops. Certainly don't arrest people who are videoing your incident. That hopefully will go to the Supreme Court soon. So there are means of determining if something is being done disproportionately to people of color by the cops and the criminal justice system as a whole. And if that's true, then it's also uncivilized racism. So what else do you do? I mean, people call for racial profiling by the TSA. They want anybody that looks brown to be searched. Anybody who's white to not be searched. That's not the country we live in. We live in a country of innocent until proven guilty. That was the purpose of the Constitution and the amendments, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. This is the same argument as after 2001, even though this is about color. No racial profiling, no surveillance of innocent people. It's a part and parcel of the same thing. We have to remember what it is that we are trying to preserve. We're trying to preserve innocent until proven guilty. That also gets into the racism of the parents, of anybody who has power over someone else. It sometimes gets to uncivilized racism, which I can't really prove, except by numbers. So when a group or any part of the institution of the criminal justice system has power, discretionary police power, who do I pull over? Discretionary police power, who do I put in a chokehold? Then giving them the additional ability to do these other types of phishing expeditions of emails and phone calls leads to other things than just these physical intrusions. There's the intrusions that are going on against everyone. Groups get terrorized when our institutions in power have discretion and cannot override their racism, which leads to uncivilized racism and a disproportionate number of blacks getting the death penalty. It's the same. So whether it's whites against blacks or whites and non-Muslims against Muslims, racial profiling cannot exist in a governmentally approved form. I'm not saying it's there, but if it is, it can't exist. It has to go away. The discretion is what kills you. And these are humans. They have discretion. So I think that an aspiration for the cops who have guns, the prosecutors who have grand jury choices, the grand juries who have indictment choices, the judges who have discretionary choices during trials, the jurors who have guilt, innocence, and punishment choices, the appellate courts who have some discretionary power reviewing the lower court proceedings, the Supreme Courts of the various states, and finally, Supreme Court of the United States, all need to aspire to overcome their prejudices and my defined racism and not have an uncivilized racist moment. Otherwise, you can deal with civil rights complaints against cops, large settlements and unjustified shootings, called unjustified by civil jury, painfully expensive. I mean, it's really these perceived injustices, or true injustices, certainly, lynchings, led to affirmative action, an attempt to cure institutional, uncivilized racism. We are never going to cure racism the way I define racism. A recognition that somebody's a different color than you. That's it. Sexism. Recognition that somebody's a different sex than you. I'm not going to go through the whole list, but it's the same. The question is, when does it become uncivilized? If I'm my own person and I happen to say the F word in a bar by mistake, meaning douche, because South Park taught me that that word really doesn't mean anything, it may offend somebody. Now that's uncivilized. But when a cop has parental racism driven into his head and it sways a discretionary time, a moment, whether or not you're going to use a gun or a taser, or whether or not you're going to put the knee in too far into their back, if you can't recognize that that's there by changing the conversation from what Fox News and CNN, MSNBC are saying, we're all racists. If I become uncivilized in my own personal behavior, I may get tossed out of a shop where I'm trying to buy something, but I said a racist comment or homophobic comment. But if I were a cop and I have the power of life and death over someone, we as a society would care more. And we would have a conversation as to whether or not the criminal justice system has institutional, uncivilized racism. We would have that conversation. Doesn't exist, doesn't happen. All I hear is, they're animals, I lived in the projects, those blacks are burning down their own town. You say that, you're an idiot. You say that to me in front of me, you're an idiot. I say it here so I don't have to say it out in public. I'll let you drink your drink. You say that all cops are racists. Now that's stupid as well. You say you know the criminal justice system has uncivilized racism in it. There is some evidence that that does occur. Similarly, if you're white, by the way, and we discuss racial profiling, talked about this before, you almost do not have a right to talk about it because you have never been racially profiled. So you can't know what it's like to be pulled over and think that it's not because your taillight's out, it's because you're black or Hispanic driving through Highland Park. So you people that don't know how to define the word racism don't even know how to have a conversation. You don't know how to even attempt to override your prejudices. You don't even know how to look back on your own history and your upbringing and the words, the N-word that you heard in your house. You need to think. And if it turns out that our criminal justice system does have institutional, uncivilized racism, we have to correct it. That's third world. I like my idea of an aspiration before you go out on your beat, though. You're going to try and overcome your racism. Little sign up on the door as you walk out. Little sign. in the courtrooms. Not in God we trust. I will attempt to overcome my prejudices and racism without admitting I have any. How does that sound? I think it would be helpful. And before you say there is no racism, be careful if you're white. You don't know what it's like. And look at numbers. And before you're someone of color that says that all cops are racists, understand a little. They have a dangerous job, and we ask them to do it. All right, let me talk a little bit about the reduction of Dodd Frank and the need for a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United. In the 1.1, whatever it was, $1 trillion spending bill that was just passed, the banks got a little relief from Dodd Frank, which was passed in 2009 following the Great Recession. This was a budget bill. Banks are having record profits. Why do we need to reduce regulation that was designed to stop another Great Recession by the risk posed by certain types of instruments and securities and capital requirements? Banks are getting record profits. Now, why would there be a reduction in regulations? A giveaway, obviously. I've talked about Citizens United. Corporations are not people. They're not entitled to free speech rights in the form of unlimited campaign contributions. It's the fear of the founders. They just didn't know. They didn't know about groups. They feared the sovereign. They feared the king. That's why they put limitations on the president. The problem is they did not and could not anticipate that the idea of suing and being sued by an entity, a corporation, a charter, that was designed to limit the risk of shareholders would turn into the ability to have a free speech right as a group. No individual has a restricted free speech right from standing on the soapbox, on the corner. That was the purpose of the right of free speech. So we, as taxpayers, now have an increased risk of having to bail out the banks again so that they can make fees when they book deals today under the newly revised Dodd Frank, so that they can pocket the money. And these particular banks give huge sums to candidates directly and super PACs indirectly. Senator Cornyn picks up the phone when Citibank calls. When Goldy calls, Cornyn does not pick up the phone. It's very, very simple. Corporations are not people. In fact, we need to, in that constitutional amendment, add a $100 maximum campaign contribution per person, per candidate, adjusted for inflation, even to your own campaign. Christine Whitman spending $50 million. That is why Dodd Frank was reduced. Had nothing to do with anything economic. They'll come up with economic justifications. You can. I think I majored in econ. Come up with whatever you want. Citizens United is the demise of democracy. The republic that we have, actually. We don't have direct democracy. We elect people in order to, and they don't have to follow what they said they might do. We don't have referendums on every item. But the corporations that have the money do, because they make that phone call. Legally. There's no conspiracy. Citizens United is painful. It is a painful case. But it came from suing and being sued. You have to be defined as a person for certain purposes, and then for a few more purposes, and then for a few more purposes. And then somehow, this corporation named Hobby Lobby is Christian. Only human beings can donate to political campaigns. There was nothing in the Constitution that anticipated these monsters called groups. Unions, corporations, groups, LLCs, LPs. We need a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United. Corporations are not people entitled to free speech rights. And freedom of religion as well. You are always entitled to go to your own church. That corporation, Hobby Lobby, does not go to church. I don't care if one person owns it. They're getting the benefits of regulations of our society that have a separation of church and state. Overturn Citizens United. That's all I have today. I want to thank all my sponsors. Delicate Genius, Velatina, Cocos, Tico Adventure Lodge, Logan. You don't have to agree with what I say, but just agree with how we're trying to figure things out. Thanks for coming out.